And welcome everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started with learning how to do some 3D modeling and animation using Blender. And if this is your first time using Blender, when you open up the app, you will notice there's this screen here, just kind of a welcome screen, asking you just for some quick setup preferences. So you can go ahead and play around with these. Probably the most common one people change is the theme, and so you can see as you manipulate these different themes, you can see how they will change the different views up here. I'm just going to leave this on Blender Dark because it's kind of a nice one here. There's other things in here such as spacebar, like what you want that to map to. We're going to leave these all here as the default for right now and go ahead and click on next. And that's going to take us here to where we kind of want to get started. Now you notice we do have a couple different options here on our screen. The first, of course, is just general. We have a 2D animation option. We have sculpting, VFX, video editing. We can open files. We can also view the manual and stuff like that. But we're just going to go ahead and jump right into a general file. And when I click on that, you can see we are left of the screen. You can see we have right here a 3-dimensional cube. And we also have here our camera. This is, if we were to render the scene, this would be the angle and lighting of where things are going to be coming down. And if I right click in here, you can see we open up a menu that allows us to get different options. We'll explore that more later on. Left clicking, of course, right now doesn't really do much for us, but we can click on our shape to drag to kind of select that shape. We can also click on our camera. And of course, our light is right here. So this is our light source right here. So this is where the lighting would be coming down for this shape. Now, one thing that is a little different from the 2-dimensional space that we might be used to working with is in the 3-dimensional plane, we have kind of these points of origin. Because remember, they aren't just left and right or up and down. We have a combination of those. And so you'll notice if we, for example, look on our camera, you can see here we have this little orange dot. All right, that is kind of the position of where in this 3D space this camera lies. If we look at our cube or we look at our lamp, you'll see that that little orange dot is now inside of those. It's kind of more of the center of those objects. So that is just one thing that's a little bit different, and you can see those locations listed out here. If we look at our transforms, you can see the different things that are already populating over here, such as our locations. We have rotational values. So these, of course, are all things that we can look at here to really help get an idea of where these things exist here within this 3-dimensional space. All right, let's go ahead and just jump right in though and start manipulating things within the space. So to get started, let's go ahead and select our cube here, and let's say we don't want this cube. We want to get rid of it. Your first inclination might be to hit the delete key, and you can do that. However, there's other shortcuts available, such as hitting X, which will bring up a prompt, which will give you a confirmation of whether or not you want to delete that. So, and if you don't want it, you can just hover off that. But again, both ways where delete will automatically remove it, or if you can press X, you can get the menu option. I'm just going to go ahead and press delete, and you can see that we have now removed that cube from our workspace. All right, so let's go ahead and add in a shape, and we can do this simply by coming up here to the add menu, and there is a shortcut you can see for that, Shift A. But we want to go ahead and add in a new mesh here. We could, of course, add a cube back in, which of course will add that same cube that we just had. Of course, we have other options here, so we can see we have circles, UV spheres, icospheres, cylinders, etc. Let's just go ahead and do a UV sphere. And if I use my scroll wheel, I can zoom in a little bit here, and you can see that we now have kind of a ball shape here. All right, pretty cool. Now, the next thing I want to show you is that if you look back over here in our scene collection, if you remember before we had a camera, a light, and a cube, when we delete that cube, you can see that it is no longer part of this space. Instead, we now have the sphere. And so the sphere is now in here because we added that in. If I were to add another shape, you would see that it is also added in here as another piece of this model. Now, one thing you might notice on our sphere here is that we have this little targeting reticle. And we can move this cursor here by going over to the cursor option. And as long as Surface Project is checked, we can then, of course, move this around here. And I can easily move around in my plane space here. One other thing that you didn't notice, obviously we can use our mouse wheel to zoom in and out. But if I hold down the Shift key and then I use my mouse wheel, I can then click and hold that mouse wheel, and I can then move around within my space here. So it's a pretty cool little trick here. Now, one thing about this point being here rather than being the center is this allows us to reposition certain things. So I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of rotate this using Alt and my mouse wheel. And you can see how that is now snapped to that surface. That's pretty cool right there. And if we want to go ahead and get this in a way that is going to really kind of benefit us here with our shape, maybe we want to add another shape onto this. Now, of course, I did kind of upset my viewpoint here a little bit, so I'm just going to press 0 on my numpad here to be able to effectively change this back. And so now let's go ahead up to our add, and let's just add onto here. Let's do another cube. And you can see where it added that cube is now at the point where this little targeting circle that we had here before is now positioned. It didn't put it in the center here where our sphere is, because if you remember, our sphere is in a totally different spot. Now with this cube, there's a little option right here that says add cube. If we toggle that, we can then have greater control over the alignment of this cube. So for example, I can readjust the size of it, so I can make it larger, I can make it smaller, and for all intents and purposes, a cube is pretty standard and straightforward. But if I were to, for example, move this cursor now to, let's say, the edge here of this, and let's go ahead and add in another sphere. I just want to show you something that's a little different here. So we'll do another UV sphere. And of course, we have a lot more options here. So for example, we still have our radius, which allows us to affect the size of this. But then we also have rings and segments, which, if you notice, are the little subdivisions that are all over this. I'm just going to increase this up in size just a little bit more so you can see this. But if I go ahead and affect the number of rings, as I increase it, you can see we add in more rings. As I decrease it, you see that it becomes, in some ways, less round. It becomes much more flat, for a better word here, almost like a cylinder here. And then if we look at the segments, if I manipulate that section there, you can see that's the number of vertical divisions here. And again, you'll see something similar happen here as we try to manipulate that into different shapes. So it gives us a lot of control over what we want that sphere to ultimately end up looking like. Now, the last thing I want to show you real quick with this model here is, if you notice up here in our scene collection, when we added that other sphere, you see it now is named sphere 0.001. And that's necessarily the most helpful thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename this just so you can show how this works. So the easiest way to do that, you can just double click on it and it'll select the text. And we're just going to call this low poly sphere. And you can see that it's now renamed and it keeps it all alphabetical for us. And the other thing I want to point out is that you'll see that the name is updated down here in the Object Properties panel. So that gives us a nice quick view of how to look at different things. And again, this is our viewpoint here. And this is a good first step for looking into the world of 3D modeling. And I can't wait to see what we get to create as we dive deeper into it.